Hattusa, 1200 BCE. The capital of an empire that once forced Egypt to sign a peace treaty hammered into silver is on fire, and nobody attacked it. The granaries are empty. The royal archive is still standing, tablets still stacked on their shelves, still recording tribute shipments from Syria, from Canaan, from the island of Cyprus. But the last document produced by this empire, the final act of a civilization that ran the International Bronze Age for 400 years, is not a battle report. It is a grain request, desperate, unanswered. An empire of more than 1 million people, and the last thing its administrators wrote was a food order that nobody filled. For 2 centuries, historians pointed at the Sea Peoples, Aegean raiders who swept through the Bronze Age Mediterranean like a force of nature in the 1180s BCE. But here is what that explanation never accounted for. The Hittite administrative record goes silent before the Sea Peoples appear anywhere in the documents. The grain request predates the raids. The capital was already emptying. The empire may not have been conquered. It may have simply dissolved, walked away from its own capital, and scattered into the landscape, leaving no body, no battle, and no explanation that any scholar has ever been able to fully close. In 2023, a research team at Cornell University, led by Dr. Sturt Manning, reconstructed precipitation levels across the Anatolian Plateau using juniper tree rings preserved in peat, some of them 3,000 years old. What those rings revealed was unprecedented. 3 consecutive years of near-zero rainfall, from approximately 1198 to 1196 BCE, across the entire breadth of the Hittite heartland. The rings for those years are so narrow, they are nearly invisible under magnification. Not a gradual decline, not a bad season followed by recovery, a catastrophic agricultural shutdown 3 years running, with no gap for relief. This study was finalized in 2023. The drought data had been sitting inside those trees for 32 centuries. Nobody had looked closely enough until now. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, appears in a cuneiform tablet discovered at the Syrian port city of Ugarit, itself burning during the same window, recording a naval engagement he fought off the coast of Cyprus. That tablet was never fired, never sent. It was found raw in Ugarit's kiln at the precise moment of that city's own destruction, around 1185 BCE. As a message suspended mid-composition, a king whose skeleton has never been located, whose burial site has never been found, whose DNA has never been extracted from a single verified bone. And when geneticists finally pulled ancient DNA from Bronze Age Anatolian burial sites, not just near Hattusa, but from 727 individuals spanning the entire arc of West Asia and the Aegean, what they found in the Hittite-era samples did not match any prediction any model had made. Not the steppe, not the Caucasus in the way anyone expected. Something older, something without a name in any language, something that had been sitting unrecognized in the genomic record for years. If you've ever genuinely wondered where civilization comes from, not the textbook answer, but the biological one, then stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The Hittites wrote Indo-European 7 centuries before Sanskrit. Their language is the oldest surviving branch of the entire family tree, the grandmother of Latin, Greek, Persian, and ultimately English. And the genome that was supposed to explain how that language arrived in Anatolia, almost entirely absent from their bones. The language is the oldest. The DNA is the most local. Those two facts cannot coexist under the model that has dominated linguistics and genetics for 30 years. One of them has to break. Engagement question. A. Post hook. Before we go any further, drop something in the comments right now. Does your family trace roots to Anatolia, the Caucasus, Armenia, Iran, Kurdistan, or anywhere in that corridor? Even just a country is enough. Because what the DNA just revealed about who the Hittites actually were and where their descendants are living today might completely change how you see your own family's story by the time this video ends. Segment 2. The Steppe Theory's Blind Spot. Breaking a model takes more than one anomaly. By 2015, the genomic theory of Indo-European dispersal appeared, by scientific consensus, essentially solved. The Yamnaya, Bronze Age cattle herders from the Pontic Caspian, steppe north of the Black Sea, had exploded outward around 3000 BCE, replacing up to 75% of the DNA of Neolithic European farmers within 5 centuries. English, Russian, Hindi, Greek, all carried downstream on the same genetic wave from the same ancestral source. The model was published in Nature. It was celebrated across disciplines, and for the Hittites, speakers of the oldest branch of that entire language family, it made one unambiguous, falsifiable prediction. Hittite-era individuals should be saturated with Yamnaya steppe ancestry. They weren't. In 2022, a team led by Dr. Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard Medical School's Department of Genetics, working alongside Dr. Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna, published the largest paleogenomic study of West Asia ever conducted. 727 ancient individuals, 10,000 years of human occupation across the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Caucasus. When they isolated the Bronze Age Anatolian samples, the individuals from the era and geography of the Hittite Empire, the steppe ancestry signal was, in their precise language, almost non-existent. Not reduced, not diluted, almost non-existent. The Yamnaya wave that had genetically rebuilt 75% of Europe hadn't reached the people who were already speaking Europe's ancestral language, and yet, the data said the exact opposite of everything the model predicted. This doesn't destroy the Yamnaya hypothesis for Europe. What it creates is a rupture inside the model that nobody had prepared for, because the Hittite language is not a peripheral Indo-European dialect. It is the earliest attested branch, the deepest root. If the oldest branch has no steppe ancestry, then either the language traveled to Anatolia by a completely different biological vehicle, or the entire chronology of when and how Proto-Indo-European dispersed has to be redrawn from its foundation. Dr. Craig Melchert, professor of Indo-European studies at UCLA, he demonstrated in his linguistic analysis that Hittite structural divergence from the Proto-Indo-European ancestor is so archaic that it must represent a departure predating the Yamnaya as a distinct population. The language left for Anatolia before the steppe herders existed as an identifiable genetic group. Something older carried it there. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. If the Yamnaya didn't originate Indo-European, if they received it from somewhere older and simply amplified it westward through demographic force, then the celebrated Yamnaya are not the source of your language. They are a relay station. The source is something that had never been named, categorized, or placed on any migration map until February of 2025. And when it was finally identified, it didn't just fill in a gap. It inverted the entire diagram. Segment 3, Between the Mountain and the River. A language this old needs a carrier, and the carrier had no name. Between approximately 4,500 and 3,500 BCE, in the narrow geographic corridor between the North Caucasus Mountains and the lower bend of the Volga River, a human population lived that no archaeologist had assigned a culture name, no historian had documented in any surviving record, and no linguist had ever pointed to as an origin point for anything. No monumental architecture, no royal inscriptions, no mythological tradition preserved under any name in any culture's oral memory. They existed, and then, in the genomic record, they spread, silently, in 2 directions simultaneously, and they rewrote the linguistic identity of half the world. In February 2025, Dr. Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard Medical School and Dr. Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna published findings in Nature that upended the entire Indo-European origin debate. Their team analyzed ancient DNA from 435 individuals recovered from archaeological sites across Eurasia, dated between 6,400 and 2000 BCE, and identified a previously unrecognized ancestral population, designated the Caucasus Lower Volga Group, or CLV. This CLV population formed a genetic continuum between Neolithic Armenia in the south and the Lower Volga at Berezhnovka in the north, and what it contributed to the populations around it was staggering in scale. The Yamnaya, the steppe herders who genetically rebuilt Europe, derived approximately 80% of their ancestry from this CLV group, not partially, not as one component among many. 80%. Everything I just told you? Hold on to it. It's about to mean something completely different. Independently, and following a completely separate migration route, Anatolian individuals from pre-Hittite and Hittite-era contexts show direct CLV ancestry, arriving not via the steppe, but via a southern path through the Caucasus, directly into Anatolia. Two separate branches of the same ancestral source population. One goes north and west, becomes the Yamnaya, reshapes Europe. The other goes south, enters Anatolia, and carries a linguistic structure that becomes the Hittite language. They share a grandparent. They are cousins under the genetic skin of entirely different civilizations. The family tree of Indo-European just gained a generation that nobody knew existed. Pinhasi's team named this population by coordinate because no culture name exists to give them. Caucasus Lower Volga. CLV, a geographic label, not an identity. We know their genome. We can trace their migration paths across 2 continents. We can identify their descendants in populations alive right now. We cannot say what they called themselves. We cannot say what they called the river at their feet. We cannot say what word they used for grief, or for harvest, or for child. This isn't just ancient history. This is in your DNA right now, and in the grammar of every sentence you've spoken today. Every Indo-European language on Earth, spoken by approximately 3.5 billion living people, descends from the linguistic structure this population carried. They are the authors of half the world's grammar. Their speech became Latin. No, it became Sanskrit. It became Persian, Greek, Russian, English, and not one syllable of the original survives attributed to them. They gave language to the world. The world gave them nothing, not even a name. Segment 4. The blood that stayed. Naming is not the same as erasing. Some of the CLV's descendants are still on the land. In population genomics laboratories from Yerevan to Ankara, researchers analyzing the autosomal profiles of modern Armenians, Anatolian Turks, and Kurds keep returning to the same deep signal, an ancestral component that aligns not with medieval Turkic migration from Central Asia, not with Greek or Roman colonial movement, but with something embedded in the Anatolian genome at a depth that predates every named civilization in the region. Dr. Sael Livan Yepiskoposian at the Institute of Molecular Biology of Armenia's National Academy of Sciences has spent over 15 years mapping this signal across populations from the Caucasus foothills through the eastern Anatolian highlands. What his analysis of HLA immune system markers, among the most stable and heritable genetic identifiers across generations, consistently shows is that modern Armenians, Kurds, Anatolian Turks, and Iranians share core ancestry traceable to the pre-Hittite Anatolian Neolithic farming population, the same farming population that constituted 60 to 86% of Hittite-era individuals. The Hittite bloodline did not disappear when Hattusa burned. It was already in the land before Hattusa was built. What they found next changed everything we thought we knew about who survived. And the Hittite Empire collapsed. The Hittite language stopped being spoken, completely, without leaving a daughter tongue, without a community that carried it forward. But the people who carried the Hittite genome kept living on the same plateau without interruption. Post-collapse Anatolian samples from after 1200 BCE show the identical DNA signature as pre-collapse Hittite-era individuals from centuries earlier. The culture was erased. The biology was not. This is not a metaphor for cultural survival. It is genomic continuity, measurable, documented, continuous, across 3,200 years. In approximately the 5th century BCE, the Armenian historian Moses Koronatsi encoded in his History of Armenia an oral tradition claiming descent from ancient Anatolian highland peoples, show from a lineage rooted in the Plateau north of Lake Van long before any written record. He had no laboratory. He had no sequencing technology. He had only the accumulated memory of a community that had been on that land by the genomic evidence since the Bronze Age. The story survived in the blood before it survived in the text. Actually, if you watched my last video on the Mycenian DNA results, you already saw the first half of this exact pattern. A culture collapses. A language disappears. The people don't go anywhere. Did that shift how you think about civilizational collapse? Drop it in the comments. Because what's coming in the next few segments is what that video was building toward, and it's considerably stranger. There are three things the genomics revealed about which living populations carry the highest concentration of Hittite ancestry today. The third one will start an argument. Modern Kurds, inhabiting eastern Anatolia, northern Iraq, and the Zagros foothills, carry a genomic profile that overlaps significantly with Hittite-era samples. Modern Armenians carry the closest living approximation to the dominant ancestry component in Hittite commoner DNA. These are not populations peripheral to the Hittite geographic range. They are populations who have lived in the same corridor without significant replacement for 7,000 years. The Hittite bloodline is not a historical footnote. It is a present-tense biological fact, and in certain political contexts, a combustible one. But here is where the story develops a specific problem. The Hittite genome we've been describing, the commoner genome, the farmers and soldiers and craftsmen, survived. The genome of the Hittite kings has never been extracted from a single verified skeleton. The great kings who commanded empires, who negotiated with Egypt and Babylon, who signed the world's first peace treaty, none of them have ever been found. And the rulers may have carried a completely different story in their blood than the people who served them. Segment 5. The Kings Left No Bones. The German Archaeological Institute has excavated Hattusa without interruption since 1906, 118 years of continuous fieldwork. In that time, researchers have recovered the Lion Gate, the Sphinx Gate, the Great Temple of the Storm God, just a royal archive containing more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets, including the Treaty of Kadesh between Hittite King Hattusili III and Rameses II of Egypt, the world's first recorded peace agreement, a replica of which has hung in the United Nations headquarters in New York since 1970. They have found administrative records, royal seal impressions, horse training manuals, diplomatic correspondence with every major power in the Bronze Age world. They have not found a single royal skeleton, not one great king, not one queen, not one royal child. Dr. Jürgen Seeher, former director of the Hattusa excavations for the German Archaeological Institute, documented in multiple publications spanning 3 decades that Hittite royal burial, described in fragmentary cuneiform ritual texts, was a 14-day ceremony culminating in the placement of cremated royal remains in a structure called a stone house. The location of that structure has never been archaeologically identified. Either the royal tombs are situated outside Hattusa entirely, were deliberately dismantled or concealed in antiquity, or, in 118 years of sustained excavation, have simply not yet been reached. But here's where it gets strange, because not yet reached is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. In 1274 BCE, though at the Battle of Kadesh on the Orontes River in what is now central Syria, the largest chariot engagement in recorded history, Hittite King Muwatalli II commanded 3,500 chariots and approximately 37,000 infantry against the forces of Rameses II. Muwatalli survived the battle. He died several years later of natural causes. His body was cremated in the royal 14-day rite. His ashes were placed in the stone house. The stone house has never been found. A man who fought the most documented military engagement of the Bronze Age, a man whose strategic decisions shaped the political architecture of an entire era, has not left a single recoverable cell. The absence of royal remains is not archaeological frustration, it is a genomic catastrophe. Hittite royal lineages, particularly the later dynasties that intermarried with Hurrian Mitanni nobility, with Egyptian palace bloodlines, with Kassite Babylonian lines, would carry an admixture profile unlike anything in the commoner samples. The commoner genome tells us who lived on the Anatolian Plateau. The royal genome would tell us who ran the Bronze Age international system. Those are potentially 2 entirely different biological narratives. In 2019, a Turkish-German survey team deployed ground-penetrating radar across unexcavated sectors of Hattusa's outer perimeter and identified multiple subsurface anomalies consistent with large, sealed chambers. Excavation has not yet reached those chambers. The DNA that could resolve every outstanding question about Hittite royal ancestry, their cross-dynastic admixture, the biological relationships between ruling houses, the genetic difference between the king and the farmer, may be 2 meters underground right now, waiting on a funding decision. Every genomic claim published about Hittite identity, every paper, every headline, every finding in this video, is built entirely on commoner samples: soldiers, craftsmen, palace servants. The 60 to 86% Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry we call Hittite DNA is the DNA of the people who served the great kings, not the great kings themselves. The king and the farmer may have carried entirely different histories in their blood, and only one of those histories has ever been sequenced. Segment 6. Case closed. Sequenced. Let's say for a moment that we have enough. And here is what the genomic evidence, across studies from Harvard, Vienna, Copenhagen, and Leipzig, now establishes about Hittite genetic identity with high confidence. The picture is coherent. The ancestry is documented. The origin is confirmed. For the first time in 3,200 years, we know, in biological detail, who the Hittites were. Dr. Füsen Özer at Ankara University's Department of Anthropology, a contributing researcher on the 2022 Southern Arc study, has helped establish through analysis of Bronze Age Anatolian individuals that Hittite-era samples carry on average 62 to 86% ancestry from Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the same agricultural population that spread into Europe around 7000 BCE. A further 10 to 23% derives from a Chalcolithic northwest Anatolian source carrying traces of steppe admixture that arrived via the Balkans around 3900 to 3600 BCE. A residual 10% traces to the CLV source via the Southern Caucasian migration path. Case closed. Mystery solved. An empire built not on invasion, not on the genetic replacement of the local population, but on top of the deepest agricultural continuity in Eurasian history. The same people who had farmed that plateau for 5,000 years before the empire built an empire on it. Everything I just told you, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. The resolution is real. Those percentages are verified across multiple independent studies, and there is something genuinely extraordinary in the result. While Europe was experiencing catastrophic genetic replacement, Yamnaya herders erasing Neolithic farmer DNA across 75% of the continent, Anatolia stood biologically still. The people who wrote the oldest surviving Indo-European texts were, by overwhelming genetic majority, the heirs of the farmers who had preceded them by 5 millennia. No rupture, no invasion that replaced them. Continuity so deep it reads as almost geologic. Now stop. Because the 2025 CLV study by Lazaridis and Pinhasi did not simply add a 10% annotation to the ancestry pie chart, it demonstrated that the CLV branch reaching Anatolia arrived carrying the specific linguistic cargo, the Proto-Indo-Anatolian grammatical architecture that became the Hittite language. So the dominant 80% Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry did not bring that language. The 10% CLV minority did. A population constituting 1/10 of a civilization's genome authored the language that civilization used to administer an empire stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates, and that language then gave birth to every Indo-European tongue currently spoken on Earth. This isn't just ancient history. A population that is 10% of your genome wrote the language you are using right now to watch this video, which forces a rethinking of something fundamental. Genetic dominance and cultural dominance are not the same thing. A biological majority can be linguistically overwritten by a genetic minority, silently, without displacement, without war, through the slow accumulated pressure of a group that arrived, bastade, and gradually rewrote the grammar of everything around them. The 80% Neolithic farmer majority inside the Hittite genome was speaking a CLV-derived language. Whatever tongue they had spoken before the CLV arrived, whatever words they had used for their gods, their rivers, their dead, those words are gone. Not erased by conquest, absorbed. And what we are left with is a question that has no surviving evidence to answer it. What language did the founders of the Hittite gene pool speak before the language that made them famous? The first language of the people who would become the Hittites. We have no idea what it sounded like. Segment 7. Linear heard the same silence. We know what it looked like. The writing, the script, the marks on clay. We just cannot read them. Linear A, the writing system of the Minoan civilization, Bronze Age Crete, contemporaries of the early Hittites, builders of the palace complex at Knossos, has been studied for 120 years without successful decipherment. Not because the tablets are damaged or the corpus is too small, because the language encoded in them has no known relatives in any direction. Every attempt to connect it to known language families has failed. It is linguistically isolated, a dead end in every family tree ever constructed, pointing toward a source that has no surviving name. Dr. Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, contributing to ancient DNA research on Bronze Age Aegean populations, was part of the team that established in 2017 that the Minoans were, like the Hittites, and overwhelmingly descended from Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the same farming population, the same deep continuous ancestry that stretched back to the Neolithic, spread from Anatolia into Europe around 7000 BCE. When the Indo-European speaking Mycenaeans culturally overran the Minoan system in the late Bronze Age, the Minoan genome was not replaced, it was incorporated. Mycenaean individuals are genetically a blend of Minoan-type Anatolian Neolithic ancestry and incoming steppe ancestry. The people survived, the language did not. But here's where it gets strange. The Minoan language that died in silence may have been related to the language the Hittites' own ancestors were speaking before the CLV arrived and overwrote their linguistic identity. Linear A may be the closest surviving script to whatever the pre-CLV Anatolian Neolithic farmers spoke before their language was absorbed. Two civilizations separated by the Aegean Sea, both predominantly descended from the same Neolithic farmer base, both having their languages erased by incoming Indo-European speaking minorities, both leaving scripts or linguistic traces that remain unread or irrecoverable. If the 80% Anatolian Neolithic farmer majority inside the Hittite genome was speaking a language related to Linear A, if there was a Neolithic Aegean Anatolian linguistic network connecting the two populations across the water, then what we are looking at is not two separate events of linguistic replacement. While it is one coordinated Bronze Age erasure playing out across the entire Eastern Mediterranean within roughly 3 centuries. One system, one silence, two names. Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who excavated Knossos between 1900 and 1935, died in 1941, convinced that Linear A would be deciphered within his lifetime. He reconstructed the palace. He repainted the frescoes in vivid color. He installed electric lights in the underground storage chambers. He was certain. He was wrong. Linear A remains unread. The Minoans' own name for themselves, the word they used for we, the word they carved above their doorways, is locked inside a script that has defeated 124 years of sustained scholarly effort. The Linear A tablets were found in 1900. The genetic reason they may never be decoded, the reason the language has no surviving relatives, only became scientifically legible in 2025. If the CLV linguistic minority overwrote the Anatolian Neolithic majority's language in Anatolia, and a parallel Indo-European minority overwrote the Minoan language in Crete, and both majorities shared the same genetic foundation, then these are not two languages that happen to die in the same era. They are two branches of the same linguistic system, replaced by Indo-European across a connected geographic world within the same few centuries of the Bronze Age. The silence of Linear A and the silence of pre-CLV Anatolian are the same silence. We simply gave them different names and filed them in different academic departments. And sitting in a museum in Heraklion, in a sealed display case, are tablets that may contain the only surviving written words of the people the Hittites descended from. Unread, unreadable, still waiting. Segment 8. What the Body Encoded in 1198. BCE. Words aren't the only things bodies remember. There is a genomic phenomenon, documented, peer-reviewed, measurable, associated with severe multi-generational famine events. Not a mutation in the DNA sequence itself, but an epigenetic modification, a methylation pattern that alters how genes are expressed in survivors, and in documented cases, is transmitted to children who never experienced the original catastrophe. Researchers studying the descendants of Dutch hunger winter survivors from 1944 to 1945 found heritable metabolic changes persisting 2 generations after the famine ended. Whilst similar markers have been identified in Holodomor survivor lineages, the body does not simply endure catastrophic starvation, it encodes it, rewrites its operating instructions in response, and in certain cases, passes those instructions forward to people who were never there. Dr. Sturt Manning, professor of classical archaeology at Cornell University, used dendrochronological analysis of preserved juniper logs and carbon isotope records from central Anatolia to establish in his 2023 Nature study that the drought of 1198 to 1196 BCE was, in his team's precise language, unusually severe and outside the natural variability of the preceding 150 years. 3 consecutive years. Near zero rainfall across the entire Anatolian Plateau. A population exceeding 1 million people with no harvest. 3 seasons running. The epigenetic consequences of that starvation cascade in the survivors. The methylation patterns, the altered metabolic gene expression written into bodies that lived through it, may have been encoded into the germline of every person who walked out of Hattusa's collapsing shadow. Stay with me, because what comes next is the experiment that hasn't been officially run yet, and it may be the most important one in the history of ancient DNA research. Ancient epigenomic analysis, the study of methylation patterns in ancient DNA samples rather than simply the sequence itself, has been demonstrated as a viable methodology. Dr. Liran Carmel at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem successfully reconstructed tissue-level gene expression patterns from Neanderthal methylation data, shows proving that epigenetic signals can survive in ancient bone and be meaningfully interpreted across tens of thousands of years. The same methodology applied to post-collapse Anatolian skeletal remains, individuals who survived the 1198 BCE drought and kept living on the plateau, could theoretically detect the epigenetic signature of the famine itself. Those bones are in museum collections right now, and yet the experiment hasn't been run, at least not officially. In 1987, a farmer outside the village of Boğazkale, built directly on the ruins of ancient Hattusa, struck a stone slab while plowing a field. Beneath it was a sealed cache of Hittite cuneiform tablets, administrative records from the final decades of the empire, still organized in the order the scribes had left them. And he had no idea he was farming the administrative center of a Bronze Age superpower. He knew only that the soil in that particular section of his field grew crops unusually well, darker, richer, more productive than the surrounding land. The Hittites had amended the palace soil with organic material for generations. The empire had been gone for 3,000 years. The soil still remembered what had been done to it. If epigenetic research on post-collapse Anatolian samples were ever conducted and found what the methodology suggests it could, a famine signature from 1198 BCE, heritable, still present in descended populations, then modern Armenians, Anatolian Turks, and Kurds wouldn't simply be the genomic heirs of the Hittites in the conventional ancestral sense. They would be carrying, in the regulation of their own cells, the biological memory of the specific catastrophe that ended the empire their ancestors built. A 3,200-year-old drought, still potentially legible, still in some form in the body. Segment 9. Who gets to inherit the Hittites? The Turkish government's official cultural heritage branding has for decades featured the Hittite sun disk, a bronze 14-pointed wheel recovered from the ancient site of Alakahoyuk, as one of the primary symbols of Turkish national identity. The sun disk appeared on the logo of Ankara's main international airport for years. It appears on official state documents, in government architecture, on commemorative currency. In Turkish nationalist historiography formalized in the 1930s under the Turkish History Thesis, a state-sponsored academic framework developed under Ataturk, the Hittites were proposed as Proto-Turks, an indigenous Anatolian population that prefigured the ethnic identity of the modern Turkish Republic. This was not a fringe argument advanced by enthusiasts. It was official state policy, embedded in school curricula and national museums. The genomic data dismantles this claim with the same precision it dismantles everything else in this story. The Hittites show near zero connection to Central Asian Turkic populations. The steppe ancestry detectable in modern Turks derives from the medieval Seljuk and Ottoman-era migrations from Central Asia, arriving roughly 2,000 years after Hattusa burned. While the people with the closest genomic claim to Hittite ancestry are, by the current evidence, Armenians, Kurds, and Anatolian Greeks, populations that have occupied that corridor continuously, without replacement, since the Bronze Age. This is not an assertion made in service of any political position. It is a mathematical output of the data. The genomics don't know about borders. The borders, however, are very much aware of the genomics. In 2022, a Kurdish cultural organization in Diyarbakir, the ancient city of Amida in southeastern Turkey, submitted a heritage recognition application citing Bronze Age genomic data from the Harvard Southern Arc study as evidence of continuous ancestral presence in the region. A peer-reviewed paper published by one of the world's most prestigious genetics programs was used as evidence in a present-day political and cultural dispute. Ancient DNA has exited the laboratory. It is now evidence in arguments about land and identity and belonging that are actively unresolved. The CLV population, the nameless ancestors of both the Hittite language and the Yamnaya, left their genetic signature across every Indo-European language on Earth, including the ones spoken by people who have no cultural connection to the Hittites whatsoever. The Hittites themselves left their genome in populations currently living inside the borders of a state whose founding mythology claimed them as its own, while the populations who actually carry that ancestry have spent generations navigating an entirely different political reality. The people with the most genomic claim to the Hittite legacy are not the people who put the Hittite sun disk on their airport. That is not an accusation. It is a data set. The world's first peace treaty was negotiated between two empires and inscribed on silver. A replica hangs in the United Nations. The people who signed it have been genetically located. They are alive. They are not who the textbooks said they were. Segment 10. The Open Wound. There is a room in the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara where the Hittite artifacts are kept. Stone orthostat reliefs, bronze ritual objects, cuneiform tablets behind glass, faces carved in basalt, in profile, looking at nothing. The museum labels tell you what culture they came from, what era, what dynasty. They do not tell you that the people whose bones produce the DNA underlying every claim in every paper cited in this video were the farmers and soldiers and craftsmen, the people who maintained the empire, and that the rulers, the strategists, the kings who made the decisions that shaped the Bronze Age world have left no recoverable biology whatsoever. We now know, with high confidence, that the Hittites were biologically the heirs of a farming population that had occupied the Anatolian Plateau for 7,000 years before the empire existed. We know that the language they spoke was carried by a minority ancestral component, 10% of their genome, from a nameless population in a corridor between a mountain range and a river bend that has no monument, no mythology, no entry in any historical record. We know that the same CLV source gave the Yamnaya 80% of their ancestry, making the Hittite language and the Yamnaya language cousins under the surface of everything. We know that the empire ended in 3 years of catastrophic drought, that the survivors kept living on the plateau, that their descendants are alive in Anatolia and Armenia and the Kurdish highlands right now, carrying genomic continuity across 32 centuries and possibly an epigenetic memory of a famine that ended a civilization. What we do not know is considerably more uncomfortable than any of that. We do not know what language the 80% Neolithic majority spoke before the CLV overwrote it. We do not know whether linear A encodes something related to that language or whether the connection is a hypothesis that will never be testable. We do not know what is in the sealed subsurface chambers that ground-penetrating radar identified near Hattusa's outer walls, chambers that may contain royal remains, royal DNA, a completely different biological narrative from the one every published study has been able to tell. We do not know what Suppiluliuma II's genome would show, or Muwatalli II's, or Hattusili III's, the king who signed the world's first peace treaty and whose bones have never been found. If you want to know what comes next in this story, what the royal chambers might contain, and what a single Hittite king's genome could rewrite, subscribe. Because this channel goes where the science goes. Even when the science goes somewhere, nobody was prepared for. The most destabilizing result of the Hittite DNA findings is not the CLV origin, and not the linguistic minority paradox, not the survival of the bloodline in living populations. It is this. The ancient DNA revolution has been running for 20 years, has sequenced thousands of individuals across every inhabited continent and has transformed our understanding of human prehistory in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. And after all of that, after all the sequencing and the modeling and the papers in Nature and Science, the people who actually ran the Hittite Empire, who made its strategic decisions, who shaped the Bronze Age international system for 400 years, remain completely genetically unknown. The commoners spoke to us. The kings are still silent.